Well, hello everyone. Welcome to my master's dissertation on not capitalizing on relative success and taking way too long to follow up on a video that outperformed most of your other content. And speaking of which, if you haven't watched that video, Monolith Sphere was a massive hit in the PC gaming space. It not only came to the party with some cutting-edge, impressive, GPU-melting visuals, but it may as well have reinvented the way first-person shooters were played at the time. After its release, you couldn't open a gaming mag or head to your favorite website without some mention of how damn good Fear was, and much like my own inability to release a video in a timely fashion, it would be a whole 4 years from its release before we would finally see it sequeled. And tensions were most certainly high. I mean, like I said, Fear essentially set the standard for action-packed, tactical first-person shooting. Its slow-mo mechanic, enemy AI, and level design may not have been revolutionary on their own, but each of them working in tandem made for gameplay that absolutely was. There was a lot riding on this upcoming sequel, and Monolith most definitely had their work cut out for them. Not only because of the mammoth task of following up such a beloved classic, but also thanks to that age-old problem in game development, legal ownership issues. Hurdles be damned though, come 2009, Fear 2 Project Origin would be installed on hard drives around the world, and the result was a resounding, well, I guess that's why we're all here, right? Oh, and by the way, if I am charismatic enough to talk you guys into trying Fear 2 out, use the link in the description. It's on sale over at goodoldgames.com, and that link will let them know that I sent you there. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews.
Probably took one to the aorta. The aorta? You think it was the carotid or the subclavian artery? Dude, making fun of a man for his knowledge is a sign of insecurity.
Like I said before, Fear, or First Encounter Assault Recon, really made an impact on its release, one that may or may not have led to a few problems plaguing the development of its sequel. See, not too long after Monolith had started work on the original Fear, they were acquired by Warner Brothers Games, which is all well and good, but they had previously struck a deal with Vivendi for publishing and distribution, which superseded the whole Warner Brothers thing. And that made for a bit of an awkward situation, because part of that deal stipulated Vivendi would maintain ownership to the rights of the name Fear, and now that Monolith had WB Games backing them, it would be kinda stupid to haggle down and work out a deal with a smaller publisher for the game's sequel. As it was, Monolith was able to legally use the characters and story that they had created during Fear's development, just not the name tied to them. So they had a pretty tough decision ahead of them, and they eventually landed on the idea of sequeling their landmark title, only dropping the name that everybody knew it as. Word on the street at the time was that this would be a Fear sequel through and through, and by the way, we will delve into that little promise further in the video, believe you me. Sadly, the only thing that would be missing was the title Fear. And you'd figure this would just ground the project before it even started, but they managed to turn this pretty massive legal issue into some good PR by holding a contest for a new name in 2007, an idea that had yet to be proven absolutely toxic and untenable in modern terms.
And the people voted online, and they chose the name Bodie McBoatface.
So to the surprise of just about everyone on Earth, it went pretty well. Project Origin was the winner of the contest, and things were actually looking up for this newly named sequel. Good news that could only be further complicated when WB would reacquire the rights to the Fear name from Vivendi. Of course, not wanting to spit in their fans' faces, Monolith decided to keep Project Origin on as a subtitle, which I think was a cool move. Oh, and here's a fun little piece of lore. Monolith liked one of the rejected names so much, they still found a way to put it in the game as an in-universe action movie and the call sign for one of their characters.
Who the hell are you? You can call me Snake Fist. Snake Fist? Are you fucking kidding me?
For all intents and purposes, this game's development was an emotional roller coaster, especially if you were following it day by day at the time. And if you were, you likely would have heard these guys had a pretty good idea concerning console ports. As I'm sure most of you are well aware, the first generation of HD consoles had yet to reach really any level of parity with gaming PCs at the time, so Monolith decided they would essentially work on two different games, one to be released on PS3 and 360 and the other one on PC. This concept actually survived pretty long into development, but about a year or so before the full game would drop, we'd get word they were abandoning that idea and instead would put all that energy into some boring, old-fashioned ports. Now, that's not exactly important in the grand scheme of things, but this game's story and how it fits into the original is, so let's jump into that instead.
Nice of you to join us, sunshine.
Alright, so to make sure everyone's up to speed, we're going to need a bit of a refresher on the events of the first game, and this will most definitely spoil a lot of revelations from that title, so make sure to skip this chapter if you've yet to play the original Fear. That being said, there are a lot of elements in this game's plot that might have a similar effect, so I guess go play Fear real quick and come back maybe. Either way, here we go.
Son of a bitch!
And let's start from the beginning because that makes the most sense. A PMC named Armacam, in the hopes of making a butt ton of money, experiments on one of its researchers' psychic daughter. From that research, they were able to develop clone soldiers who can be telepathically controlled, but Alma, the daughter, wasn't exactly mentally stable enough to do it. I guess becoming a lab rat by the time you turn 8 will do that to a person, but more importantly than that, she wasn't exactly well learned in the ways of military tactics. So Armacam decides to use her DNA to clone a few potential psychic platoon leaders who can control the new army they've taken to calling replicas. These embryos were inseminated into Alma at the ripe old age of 15, and as soon as she gives birth, they're taken away from her. After losing her babies, Alma subsequently loses what's left of her mind, and the result is a disaster where she's able to psychically connect with one of her children, Paxton Fettel, who then takes control over a few replica soldiers, leading to a bit of a coup. After this, everyone at Armacam sees Alma as more of a threat than a potential source of profits, and everyone, including her own father, signs off on sealing her away in an underground tomb. Years later, there's a second attempt at a coup with Paxton Fettel taking control over the replica soldiers, only this time it was successful. An elite team of badasses specially trained to combat your more extraordinary threats called Fear are sent in, and we play as a member of that team known only as Point Man. Our guy here is a new recruit to Fear, participating in his first real operation, the goal being to neutralize Paxton Fettel and thus shut down the replicas, but early into the operation, Point Man suffers from a lot of odd hallucinations. After several massive cock-ups, we learn about not only Armacam's experiments on Alma, but also that Point Man is the other child she gave birth to, which may just explain why he's able to move around in slow motion and bicycle kick people to death. Not exactly keen on carrying on the family legacy, Point Man eventually catches up with Paxton and gives his brain a nice air cooling upgrade. While that's going on, Alma's father, Armacam researcher Harlan Wade, in a bout of sudden guilt, decides he's going to make up for the lifetime of torture he visited on his own daughter by letting her out of the sarcophagus-like coffin she was buried in. Alma, much more alive than you might assume given her years and years of being stuck in a hole with no food or water, immediately kills her dad, and in the interest of not letting a massively powerful psychic loose on a world that she hates, Point Man overloads the facility's nuclear reactor in hopes of stopping her. This causes a massive explosion, which was sort of all for naught when the game ends on Alma making her way into Point Man's escape chopper, leaving a whole lot of stuff up in the air for a sequel. And speaking of which, that brings us just about current, so let's jump into the present day. In Fear 2, you play as Beckett, a member of an elite Delta Force unit. It's about half an hour before the end of the first game, and your mission is to secure Genevieve Aristide, a woman who just so happens to be the president of Armacam and the voice that can be heard over the phone after the credits have rolled in the first game, assuring some US senator that things have been contained and Fettel has been stopped. During the events of the first game, a lot of stuff Armacam would rather stay buried was brought to light, and the fear, see what I did there, is that the company's board of directors will make moves to silence her, a prediction that is almost immediately proven true when we run into mercenaries assumingly working for the company. During the operation, you find evidence of some kind of existing plans for every single member of your Delta Force team. There's not a lot of time to ask questions though, as there's a little localized war going on in this upscale apartment complex. Aristide, happy to be on the side that's not trying to kill her, accepts Beckett's protection, but before anyone has a chance to be rescued, the events of the last game's ending catches up with us. As you float in and out of consciousness, you see Aristide standing there with a few G-men, ordering them to load you into a chopper. In your nuke-induced coma, you have waning visions of doctors laboring under Aristide's orders doing some, let's call it, elective procedures. After this, Beckett wakes up to find himself in more or less one piece and starts immediately getting in contact with his surviving team members who were also taken into this hospital to be operated on. As you explore, you find documents describing your procedure as an activation, and it definitely activated something because you now have the slow motion abilities Point Man had in Part 1. Before you can really get your bearings, though, you find out Armacam has sent a unit to the hospital to get rid of any evidence tying the company to what went on there, which means a lot of killing and burning, and sadly, you and your team count as evidence. During your escape, you're contacted by a guy calling himself Snakefist, which is an awesome name. This guy seems to know exactly what's going down not only in the hospital, but also what caused the nuclear apocalypse outside. He tells the team about Alma and how all of this is going to get a hell of a lot worse if they don't destroy her. Aristide also catches up with you and has you get inside some kind of a device telling you it's going to help you deal with Alma. That little process is interrupted though, and the attempted escape gets back underway. As you make your way through the hospital, some of your teammates start exhibiting what I like to call Alma-related psychosis.
Stay away from her. She's mine.
Because of their newfound powers, they're all acting as beacons to her, and she's calling out to them. One of your teammates attacks you out of jealousy because he wants Alma all to himself, but is immediately killed by her in a pretty harrowing scene. With a little more information gained through scattered documents, we find out this Project Harbinger that we all seem to be lab rats for was meant to create psychic commanders who can control the replica troopers. Which does make sense they'd be looking for a new method, seeing as how their previous one required cloning a person and raising him to maturity. Oh, and who can forget their less than stellar track record with violent uprisings. It looks like the new plan is to take already battle-hardened candidates and use them in place of clones made from Alma's genetic material. An idea so simple, you gotta ask yourself, why wasn't this the first thing they tried? After fighting their way out of the Armacam hospital, which turned out to be pretty deep underground, the team heads towards a private school where Snakefist is held up. Once inside, you'll find out this place was used by the company in order to designate candidates for Harbinger, and funny enough, you apparently went to it as a child. You eventually meet up with Snakefist, who ends up being an Armacam researcher. This guy's got tons of company secrets to give us, including the fact that Aristide is about as untrustworthy as we assumed in the first place. It turns out the chamber she made us get into before was a sort of amplifier that was meant to let Alma get our scent a little easier. Now, I'd like to point out the obvious irony of Monolith constantly thinking that smart computer types look like this when I assume that's what they all are, but aside from that, Snakefist says our only real hope is to get to a company-owned nuclear site and hop into a machine that will further develop our psychic powers. This apparently being the only thing that would let us survive an encounter with the part witch, part ghost Alma. Snakefist then transfers all of his files to us, which is good because if this conversation had lasted 2 minutes longer, we would have gotten nothing out of him.
Now, let's get the hell out of here.
So on to the nuclear facility, and in the process, we sadly lose one more of our team to Alma's influence. After fighting past a small nation's worth of replicas, we finally make it into the building and we're met with what I would call a really cool scene. See, throughout the game we've been getting these hallucinations from Alma showing us her life as an experiment, and each time we end up back at this one location. A big open field containing little more than some grass, a tree, and a swing hanging from it. After getting inside the facility, we come across this place in real life, and it makes for a really interesting moment of realization. This whole time we've been dealing with Alma's ghastly, corrupted form, and it's easy to see her as some kind of a movie monster, but in reality at one point she was just a little girl.
Take her back to the vault.
A little girl with psychic abilities, sure, but I mean, you gotta feel bad. She spent nearly her entire life being experimented on, and because this scene is so prevalent in all of her projections, we can assume this place was one of respite for her, somewhere she could go and not be poked or prodded at. And from her childish perspective, this must have looked exactly like it does in your hallucinations, with wide open space and vegetation, when in reality the place is just run down and sort of pathetic. I think that juxtaposition really tells you a lot about Alma and what she went through. Even before her children were taken away from her, her life was so shitty that a small patch of dirt with a tree growing on it was the most serene, beautiful place she could imagine. I really like this moment, and in all honesty, out of all the actual out loud story in the game, I found this little piece of it to be the most emotionally impactful. I truly couldn't tell you whether or not the developers actually meant for this to have the sort of effect it did on me, but I don't know, I kind of got into it. Further inside the building, we find the amplifier we were told about, but anything past here is going to require a little more spoiling than we've done so far, so you guys know the drill. I'll have a timestamp on screen, and I'll mark this spot as spoilers in the chapters, so skip past here if you're looking to play this game for yourself. For everyone else, let's get down to business. After finding the amplifier, things go relatively according to plan until Aristide shows up and decides instead of using it to make Beckett powerful enough to stop Alma, she's going to use it to lure Alma in and seal the two of them in there together. The plan apparently being to use Alma as a bargaining chip to ensure the company stops trying to kill her. And that's pretty much exactly how it goes down. Our partner Stokes tries to intervene, but Aristide kills her, and not too long after that, the guest of honor arrives. Now, you'd think being sealed inside of a ball with a vengeful psychic zombie would be bad enough, but, well, remember how mad she was about having her kids taken away? Well, it seems like she's in the market for a new one, and you are literally the only man in the world as far as she is concerned. As Alma straddles Beckett, he starts to hallucinate and intermittently gets to wake up to the terrifying reality of, well, in the spirit of being mature, let's call this forcefully being used as an insemination device. Damn, nailed it. And that, people, is why I get paid the big bucks to make this kind of hard-hitting analysis. The game ends on Beckett coming out of his hallucinatory state to see Alma standing there already well into her pregnancy. She reaches out, takes his hand, places it on her belly, and we end on the sound of this little abomination growing inside of her should-be-dead body. If you ask me, Fear 2's story is probably the most faithful thing contained in the entire game. Now, it definitely does take a lot of the subtext and subtlety out of Fear 1's approach to story, but to be fair, when you end a game on a nuclear explosion, you sort of ruin any chance of those conspiracies staying secret for very long. I really like seeing a little more of what Alma went through during her time as a human lab rat, and it does seem like a bit of a stretch that the company was able to recreate the effects of Paxton Fettle's entire life with some surgery done on the fly, but, I mean, come on. Is that really the craziest thing that's happened in the series? It was also great to see more of Fear's secretive web of PMCs, government cover-ups, and shady deals. Sadly, because of the whole city going up in a mushroom cloud thing, we get to see a little less of it as it's happening, but we do get a little further context into what other programs Armacam had going on during the events of Fear, and that's actually kind of cool. However, despite the fact that I truly did like the story more than anything else in the game, I do think it has a few major issues. First and foremost is the nature by which it's told. Fear, like it or not, used a sort of non-linear method for revealing some of its story content. Scattered across the game were phones containing answering machine messages, emails, and other scattered documents. Some of these would contain mundane stuff like company bigwigs being accused of sexual impropriety or people just trying to get a hold of employees after replica soldiers attacked the place. Sometimes, though, you might get pieces of the puzzle that was Fear's background lore. Now, to be honest, this isn't exactly the most efficient way to tell any story, but it did reward those who were really into Fear's world while not punishing those who weren't. I mean, if you didn't dig the whole storytelling aspect of the game, something I'm sure was at least relatively prevalent, you could just play it as a series of shootouts with smart AI-controlled soldiers. And at first, it may seem like Fear 2, on the surface, offers that same experience. You can find files and pieces of data that give you a more full look at the events going on in this world, but there are two issues with this in my opinion. First off, there are no voiced files here. It's either cutscene-driven exposition or text files in Fear 2, which sort of feels cheap to me. I don't think I'm crazy when I say being able to put real-life voices to the players in Fear's world was relatively important in a lore sense. I mean, there's a reason audio logs are still so popular in games today. Sure, they may be a little overdone, but there's not many other ways to allow players to discover more about the game world without gluing everyone to their seats and making them watch exactly what's going on every single time the dev wants to reveal something. And not having this stuff does kind of suck, but it's not as big of a deal, especially when you consider just how forward and obvious these things are. In Fear, you would have to put together a little narrative puzzle by gleaming small details from a conversation between bigwig executives over voicemail. But in Fear 2, the exact project you're involved in, along with every single dark deed it hopes to accomplish, is spelled out for you in plain English with absolutely no subtlety. Was there something you may have felt curious about while playing the game? Well, don't worry, by the time you get that feeling, you're likely no more than a few minutes away from some document that'll explain every minute detail you were wondering about.
Doc, this thing isn't gonna sterilize him or anything, right? That would be the least of my concerns.
I don't know. To me, that reeks of Monolith either losing confidence in their audience or, even worse, dumbing things down for better mass market appeal. It's small, I'll admit, but it does result in a more shallow-feeling story in my opinion. Plus, and this is an even tinier issue, in the first game we got our info from voicemails, which a person would need top clearance to even be around, or from hacking the computers of people calling the shots. In Fear 2, information regarding top secret plans for illegal activities are just sort of lying around in the open. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but that bothers the hell out of me. Regardless though, I still think Fear 2's story is its best draw. Now, is that good news for a first-person shooter concerned mostly with its gameplay? Maybe not, but you gotta work with what you got. And what we have here is a nice follow-up to a world that was expertly built in the first game. Sure, it may go a little hard with revealing anything and everything the player may be foggy on in a minute-to-minute basis, but I think that's the danger of sequels in general. Sure, it's easy to keep intrigue going for a single title, but eventually you're gonna have to tell players what the hell's going on. Or I guess you could take the Team Silent route and spend the next 20 years not answering basic story questions from fans. Either one works.
I'm at a loss for words.
Oh, and I forgot to mention, Fear 2 has a DLC campaign which sees you taking control of a replica soldier as Paxton Fettel reaches out from the afterlife and takes control of him. There isn't any story revealed here other than a nice little teaser for what's going to be going down in Fear 3, so there's nothing really for me to talk about.
Dreams of death, of blood and fire, of her.
DLC aside though, if you're looking for a little more context on a killer world filled with backroom deals made between government officials and major players in a pharmaceutical company, it's basically this or a few scattered episodes of X-Files or Fringe. Damn, it's just now hitting me how bad we need more government conspiracies in our first-person shooters, and yes, that does count as mentioning Deus Ex, so you do have to install it now. And here is where things get complicated, which is ironic seeing as Fear 2 is a relatively simplistic first-person shooter. You move through linear levels designed to feed you through heavily scripted paths, and on the way, shoot a replica or, I don't know, 1,000. Aside from the slow motion mechanic, there's really nothing much else to it. It's a recognizable formula. You use guns to put holes in bad guys and endeavor to not have that same fate visited upon you. It's not exactly complicated, and if it weren't for the existence of the first Fear game, this gameplay section would probably end in the next few sentences. Which is a bit of a warning for you guys. The rest of this section is going to be me comparing features back and forth between the two games and showing where and when Fear 2 comes up lacking. I guess I could sit here and go into detail about how the game actually plays out, but in doing so, I would need to reference the first game anyway, so I figured why not skip the pretenses and go straight for the jugular. I imagine it's gonna get at least a little annoying hearing me constantly say, well, back in the first Fear game a million times, but I think this is a special case, so try to bear with me. Like it or not, Fear revolutionized first-person shooting in its day. It was a massive release in the genre, and even though it may not be entirely fair, Fear 2 was always going to be held up against its origin as a point of comparison. And if you've even glanced momentarily at a video game review at some point in your life, you've likely heard that comparison does not favor the second game very well. For a myriad of reasons I'm about to get into, Fear 2 falls miles short of the fast, frantic, and tight experience its forefather delivered. I know I should probably wait till later on in this section to come to that conclusion, but I feel like it's just about common knowledge at this point. So instead, I would like to A, focus on why exactly that is, of course trying to skip the surface level, it just doesn't feel the same, and B, make an argument for why this doesn't necessarily make Fear 2 a bad video game. Alright, so first things first, just like the previous section, we're going to need to start with a bit of a history lesson. What made Fear the landmark title it was back in its day was a combination of a few different elements. First off, the shooting felt tight and provided a lot of feedback, an element that cannot be understated in a first-person shooter. Then of course there was the slow-mo mechanic, which definitely wasn't brand new at the time. I mean, you could point to 10 or 15 releases that managed to implement some version of this just in the year or two before Fear's release. What made it work so well was the fact that it was incredibly well tuned. Bullets actually existed and had velocity compared to the typical hit scan method used almost since the genre's inception. Your movement speed was just slightly faster than your enemies, which meant you could set up some really cool shit, then deactivate slow-mo and watch the results of your actions play out in real time. Believe me, it was a feeling you couldn't get anywhere else beside maybe Max Payne at the time. And the final cherry on top of the giblet-covered cake was a combination of two very important game design mechanics coming together. First up, you had some very well-made enemy AI that allow bad guys to take multiple paths and utilize all kinds of tactics to get at you. Now, to be fair, the actual effectiveness of this AI has turned into a bit of an old wives' tale since the game's release, with it not being as smart as most people believe it to be, but the reason that rumor gets around so easily is because the AI is complemented by great level design. Most arenas you fight in are going to have 2, 3, or even 4 entries and exits, and there's also verticality to them, leading to really dynamic shootouts. Basically, you're not going to have the same firefight more than once. Competent AI and level design made to play to that AI's strengths turned out to be an award-winning combination, and because of that, Fear is always going to have an influential spot in the pantheons of first-person shooting. And with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about how Fear 2 fails to live up to that lineage in almost every single way. And I think the biggest change that'll be obvious right after the intro sequence is just how linear Fear 2 is. In the first game, you were given a fairly large environment to explore, and in doing so, you would relatively organically come across combat arenas and memorable fights. The goal was usually to find some sort of MacGuffin like a switch, key, or character, and doing that would often just unlock another large environment for you to explore. It was decidedly old school for the time, playing out more like early FPS games, and while I did enjoy the idea in spirit, one of the game's biggest downsides for me was the fact that it was so damn easy to get lost in some of these levels. You'd find yourself coming across the same arenas, hallways, and landmarks over and over again despite taking what you thought was a completely different path. It certainly could have used some improvement, but I don't think the answer was to outright get rid of it, which is exactly what Fear 2 did. Each section of the game acts like a straight line to the end goal. Sure, there may be a bit of a winding design to things, but doors are locked and barricades are in place to ensure that there is no wandering off the beaten path here. No exploration is necessary in Fear 2, and if you do manage to find some kind of a hidden secret, it is almost always going to be in a single small room that is attached to the main hallway you're taking. This was a pretty large downgrade in my eyes, since a big part of what made Fear so fun was that it sort of dropped you into its game world and let you look around. Now obviously you were still at the mercy of the game devs, but it was the invisible hand of the creator at its best.
You have to use a light touch, like a safecracker or a pickpocket.
With its lack of exploration, Fear 2 is left feeling sort of flat and average. I mean, it's not bad linear design, but there's just not much separating this game from anything that was out at the time. And like a spider's web of problems, that leads us to another issue. Because Fear 1's levels were so big and had so many paths you could take, combat arenas were able to use that genius design I was talking about earlier. Replicas could conceivably get at you from anywhere, and if you were able to halt their advance, you could be sure a few of them had slinked off into some side hall that dumped them out right behind you. It was truly something to see at the time. These fights were dynamic as hell. I mean, if an object got knocked over in the fray, they would either climb over it or use it for cover. It made for so much more of a fluid feeling to its combat. In fact, the general rule among Fear players was after killing 1 or 2 replicas, it was probably a good idea to get moving and reposition yourself, because sitting too long in one spot would almost always result in some clone trooper taking advantage of all the chaos and sneaking up behind you. In Fear 2, however, the spots where you encounter enemies are almost always just small rooms with one way in and another way out. This means each and every fight ends up playing out in the exact same way. You walk into the room, your enemies also walk in, both parties take cover and start shooting at each other till one side wins. I mean, listen, it's not exactly a losing formula. It is the way a whole lot of shooters did and still do function, but after the first game's incredible take on fast-paced first-person shooting, this feels like such a massive downgrade. I think this section right here is probably the best example I could find. Shooting these guys is still satisfying and they do still pose a threat, but they're all just funneling into the room in front of me. This is a straight line and there's no way for one of them to sneak around behind me, and because of that, there's no real reason for me to switch my tactics up from getting behind a wall and peeking out to take pot shots. Compare that to a similar section of Fear 1 early in the game, and the difference is night and day. I've got to stay mobile here, and the threat of soldiers taking that side path is always there. That forces me to keep my head on a swivel and move from spot to spot, because even if one section of cover is safe right now, it very likely won't be for long. The difference is really noticeable when you're actually playing the game, but here, take a look at this. I'll put an example of a typical Fear 2 encounter up and try to take note of the little things, like how much I'm moving and what the enemies are up to. Now take a look at a typical encounter from the first game. Notice the dynamic nature of the fight, how mobile I've got to be to stay alive, and how the enemies split up to divide and conquer. Fear 2 feels more like a shooting gallery a lot of the time, although I will say the few times you have encounters that feel like the first game, it makes for a very awesome experience. I think the best example being this section right here where the replica soldiers are spawning in randomly from these tubes. You never really know if they're behind you or beside you, and you've got to move around a lot. Sadly though, there is a black cloud hanging over even these more fun sections of the game. Fear 2's weapons feel flat out pathetic to shoot. Audio and visual feedback is almost non-existent, with nearly every single entry in the roster feeling underpowered based solely on how they sound alone. They also fail to do as much damage as you would expect, leading to enemies feeling like massive bullet sponges. In Fear, the simple act of shooting guns at bad guys just felt satisfying, with all kinds of feedback letting you know you were firing something powerful, but in its sequel, you may as well be flicking rocks at the replicas. It takes so many damn hits to down anything, and with some piss poor sound effects, terrible accuracy, and the fact that you getting shot while aiming down sights will move your aim by what seems like miles, the feeling is only multiplied. Now in fairness, Fear 1 also suffered from incredibly inaccurate weapons, but A, they seem to pack way more of a punch both in effectiveness and overall feel, and B, Fear allowed for a little trick that helped in reducing your spread. There was a feature in Fear 1 that let players lean around corners to get the edge in fights, and while this is a great mechanic to include in any shooter, it had the added benefit of reducing bullet spread even while moving and not actually leaning around any corners. Of course, it doesn't seem like this was an intended effect, so I'm not going to get too pissed at Part 2 for not including what was effectively dev jank players found out worked in their favor, but why not include leaning at all? This game seems to emphasize cover far more than the first, and it seems crazy that a game centered around player mobility would have this option, but the game where you're going to want to be behind something most of the time wouldn't. Thanks to the combination of accuracy, soft-ass sound work, and poor feedback, I never really found a weapon I enjoyed using. Sure, some of them were more effective in some situations, but I never really locked into a groove and found a gun I could really have fun with. Even late-game weapons like the laser and sniper rifle just felt weak and sort of cumbersome. Now, I'll be honest with you, that I can sort of learn to get over, but what I can't is Fear 2 committing first-person shooter heresy by having not one, but two absolutely terrible shotguns. Something that sucks way more because this pump action is, aesthetically speaking, one of my favorite shotguns in video games. It's really pleasing for me to look at, but it sometimes takes upwards of 4 up-close hits to down anything with. And you may think rationally that this issue would be remedied when you picked up the auto shotgun, but this thing is just as piss weak. This is absolutely criminal. And it certainly doesn't help that enemies don't seem to react very much to being shot. Just about the only thing that actually felt like it was being hit by my bullets was this weird creepy crawly guy, which is a little ironic because this is the one and only scenario where the shotgun's actually viable. It totally shreds these things, and you kinda wish it had that same effect on normal enemies. Now listen, I know this constant stream of pissing and moaning has long gotten old, but you gotta bear with me, there is still more to cover. For example, Fear 2's shameful lack of good sound design. In the first game, you could distinctly make out shells hitting the ground, bullets ricocheting off the walls, enemies calling out your location or communicating with other squads, and it made for an amazing auditory experience. It was insane. Fights felt so present and impactful thanks to a tight focus on sound, but there was more to it than that. There was also a gameplay component. And to properly explain it, I kinda have to talk about its direct opposite. In Fear 2, I often found myself taking cheap shots just after I thought I had cleared a room. I would struggle through a fight, feel like I had won it, then proceed forward to pick up some ammo or armor, and I'd get tagged by some asshole I didn't even know was there. In the first game, like I said, enemies used near constant callouts to give you an idea of what they were up to, but in this game, it's very rare they'll say much of anything, so I'd never really know when an encounter was truly over. Sometimes I'd wait around and see if more soldiers would pour into the room, and after a minute, I'd assume it was safe, but it seemed like there was always just one more guy keeping quiet so he could snag me with a stray hit. More important than the callouts though, Fear 1 had enemies giving you vocal cues that would let you know when the killing blow had been struck. In Fear 2, this element seems to be missing like half of the time, and it makes it really hard to determine when an enemy's actually dead. The game already has these guys taking full magazines to down, and even then their death animations look very similar to their pain states, especially in slow motion when these animations can take a pretty long time to actually play out. And I wasn't exaggerating, I would truly estimate half the replicas I killed in this game actually triggered some kind of a vocal cue on death. It would happen fairly often. I would walk into a room, kill one guy, and he'd give me some sort of a vocal cue that let me know he's not a threat anymore, but the next two guys decide they're not going out like that. Oh, and this is way more important in my mind. I also noticed that grenades have been severely nerfed in Fear 2. The first game was great about making explosives something that could really turn the tides in a fight. They did killer damage and the splash was absolutely not to be fucked with, but in Fear 2, it's essentially random. Here, look at this. This one grenade equals instant death in this one scenario, but in another section, a grenade can land just inches away from someone's feet and you'd figure I blew a fart at him from all the damage it does. In my playthrough, I would estimate maybe 30-40% of the time I could actually land a kill with a grenade, so at one point they stopped being a weapon in my arsenal and instead functioned as a tool I could use to stagger enemies so that I could shoot them with guns that actually kind of work. Sadly, the same thing goes for environmental explosions. Exploding barrels and other shootable hazards just weren't something I could use to net a reliable kill anymore, and thanks to that, towards the end of the game, I just stopped aiming at them. Even the mounted grenade launcher would only kill someone if I nailed a direct hit. Splash damage seemed to do absolutely nothing. As you can imagine, this is a very disappointing change, because with the weapons no longer feeling impactful either, you now have nothing in your arsenal that feels as substantial as even the handgun in the first game. However, I will say, in a very rare case of developers actually listening to their player base, we were able to get a version of Fear 2 that implemented a lot of fan requests. Now, it may have been a DLC campaign, but, I mean, you gotta take what you can get here. In the Reborn DLC, the difficulty seems much more tough in a very satisfying way. I had to actually play smart and stay mobile, as opposed to my tried and true find cover and pop out every once in a while method used in the base game. Replica soldiers also used callouts a lot more here. They talk about where you are, and you hear them announce when reinforcements are coming, or even heavy artillery. In this sense, it's a lot closer to the first game than Fear 2 proper. Overall, this is a really short but really fun little piece of DLC. Story-wise, it acts like a sort of bridging of the gap between the second and third game, but gameplay-wise, it plays a lot more like a Fear than a Fear 2. As far as that actual story goes, this entire sequence, in my opinion, could have been covered by a sentence of in-game dialogue, but regardless of that, as far as gameplay goes, it's definitely worth checking out. If anything, just to see how good Fear 2 could have been. Now, that was about 4 pages of this script just dedicated to how this game doesn't stack up to its point of origin, but here's where I hit you with something that flies in the face of all that. Fear 2 is a perfectly fun shooter. I mean, I shouldn't have to tell you, it's obviously no Fear 1. It lacks a lot of the more dynamic elements found in its predecessor's combat, and despite having the same slow motion and melee mechanics, it just doesn't play as satisfyingly, but it's still pretty okay. I remember Fear 2 getting raked over the coals when it first came out, and honestly, I get why. People were expecting more Fear, and they most certainly did not get that, but I'd say what we got was an okay enough time. It is very by the numbers, and you can essentially prepare yourself for everything you'll experience here just by remembering some other FPS games you played from this era, but generic isn't always a synonym for bad. In fact, and I know I'm going to catch a lot of shit for this, I think there are a few things that Fear 2 may have done better than its predecessor. For example, I think the ragdoll physics here are a big step up from the last game. They still maintain that classic Fear touch with enemies flying into the air from a single headshot, but the 75% of the time they're not doing that, bodies collapse much more realistically and corpses seem to have a little more in-game weight on death. I also think Fear 2 has a much more solid pace than its predecessor. The first game was incredible, there's no doubt about it, but it did start to drag ass in the office section and again in the last leg of the campaign, but Fear 2 skates along at a nice brisk pace. I didn't feel like the experience was on fast forward or anything, but areas felt like they lasted about as long as they needed to. And I don't want you guys thinking I'm out here excusing all the mistakes they made in following up Fear 1. I'm definitely not doing that, and a lot of those aspects do have a negative effect on the game, but I guess given the bad press around this thing, I was just expecting far worse. Like I was saying before, though, there is a lot getting in the way of the good time that can be had with Fear 2. Throughout this entire playthrough, I felt like a really fun, entertaining game was just outside of my reach. Like every encounter had this more fun, better playing combat I could get close to, but never really achieve. There definitely are times when that better playing video game would break through the surface and I'd find myself cracking a bit of a smile. These were short-lived moments for sure, but every once in a while I'd nail the odd satisfying grenade throw or take someone out in a really fun way. Now I do have to stress, these cool moments didn't even make up a quarter of my playtime, but you can tell there's some kind of potential there. Potential that is largely unrealized, but potential nonetheless. So in the end, if we're just going off gameplay, it is a very complicated story. On one end, I find it to be an okay, if not boilerplate and sometimes fun experience, but if we're talking about legacy and we actually hold it up to the game it gets its name from, then things start to trend more negatively. Overall, I didn't exactly hate my time with Fear 2, and at points I was really happy with it, but it's a game I'll likely never play again. Now, you might say that's not the best way to feel about a video game you've just finished, but it's also not the worst. So I guess my recommendation for people who've never played the game and really only have their opinion based off of reviews they've read is, well, just know that everyone who's compared it to the first game is telling the truth about basically everything they've said, but they may have over-exaggerated the negative traits here in the second game. So maybe try it for yourself and figure out whether or not you land on my end or the rest of the internet side. Moving on to Fear 2's presentation, and man, I'd love to tell you things start to simplify here, but sadly this is just as complicated a case as its gameplay. The first Fear game had a very recognizable look to it, high contrast black levels matched with a very cool color palette. It was a very sanitized style that made use of industrial designs for most of its areas. It essentially existed somewhere between the first Matrix movie and someone's late 90s loft-style apartment. Deep, impenetrable shadows, punctuated by harsh, well-defined light shafts. Like I said, it's recognizable. It's one of those games that most people could see a single, out-of-context frame from and know exactly what they were looking at, and I'd wager the same is true for Fear 2, just not in the way the developers would probably like. And what do you guys say we quit tap dancing around the issue and rip this band-aid off? I would argue that every single one of Fear's major visual themes did not survive the transition to the sequel, and if they did, they've been altered to such a degree that they may as well not be there in the first place. The game seems to rely heavily on complementary pastel tones, which is fine, but sort of flies in the face of the look its predecessor popularized. On top of that, I'd say the effect is a little too strong and obvious. When this kind of trick is pulled off well, you'll almost not even be sure that you're looking at an image that's been color graded to better give off a certain feeling, but here in Fear 2, the entire hospital section seems to be lit by fluorescent lights with bluish-green filters over them. And once you make it above ground, you get the same effect, but it switches to a greenish-yellow tone. It is a very noticeable difference jumping from Fear 1 to Fear 2, but if you see two similar scenes side by side, it really drives the point home. Here on the left, we have Fear 1, and notice its cool, if not a little neutral color tone. In fact, a majority of the color in the scene comes from what the characters are wearing and the overall design of the environment. On the right-hand side, we've got Fear 2 with its noticeably harsh and sort of garish overhead orange lighting. You see what I mean by very obvious color grading? I would say the difference between the two are night and day, but it's more like night and dusk before a tornado. Now, you might argue the difference here is totally warranted because these are two separate releases, and I guess there is some truth to that, but my rebuttal would be twofold. First off, in my opinion, it's just a less attractive color palette, but more importantly than that, this just does so much worse of a job at conveying the overall tone the game's trying to achieve. The cool colors used in the first game really complemented the horror atmosphere it was trying to cultivate most of the time, and it fit with the heavy contrast between bright, blinding lights and dark so black they seem to cut the light in half. Here in Fear 2, things take on this bright, colorful look, and any kind of actual horror sort of goes out the window. Even in the moody, dark moments in the game, everything from your weapons to the on-screen enemies and even their blood is lit up like Christmas with these blinding, bloom-lit neon accents. The effect gets even worse when you activate slow-mo, which, on top of applying even more of a puke yellow color to the screen, overdrives lighting effects like bloom, so enemy accent lights end up blinding you, and if they don't, the muzzle flash from your own guns will do the job just fine. Now, these odd lighting decisions are certainly something that people talked about before and after the game's release, but as far as controversies go, this one played second fiddle to something even stranger. See, Fear 1 was released in a sort of in-between trends kind of time for FPS games, and by the time Fear 2 hit shelves, a lot of the genre style had noticeably changed. At this point, it was not uncommon for you to run into grown men ready to piss their pants because a first-person shooter allowed for reloading and the use of iron sights aiming. You know, you can swap out the actual issues, but the more this industry changes, the more it stays the same. Now, you can certainly like what you want in FPS games, but the fact of the matter is, first-person shooters had evolved by this point, and if you ask me, there's nothing wrong with aiming down a gun's sights in this type of game, or at the very least, it makes more sense than Fear 1's idea, which was looking really hard and seeing further somehow. However, what didn't help the argument was the previously mentioned blinding light effects that ruined this act in the game. And just to be clear, iron sights aiming is perfectly fine and I enjoy using it a lot, but it's Fear 2's visual design that's to blame for it not working here, as opposed to this being some sort of an overarching example of why they shouldn't be in modern games, which sort of was the rhetoric back then. Now, in the game's defense, there are a few sections that lack the weird color overlay effects that plague the rest of its locations, and I'd say these sections are the best for showing off how good this game can really look. It's a much more clean, impressive look, and as long as you're not using a lot of slow-mo, it's a pretty wild difference. And, you know, I think we've spent long enough avoiding the obvious. You've seen it this entire time, but if you haven't noticed, Fear 2 has a pretty obnoxious heads-up display. Around this time in gaming, it seems like a lot of titles were trying to find a way to incorporate their HUDs into the game world better, and I'll be honest, I'm not exactly against these kind of visor-style HUDs in theory, but I feel like it's just way too intrusive here. And this is such a petty complaint, but it really did bother me that in the beginning they were talking about it being a visor, but when you wake up in the hospital, they turn out to be just a pair of Ray-Bans. Now, you guys know me, I am typically the kind of guy who likes to turn off all heads-up graphics when and if I can anyways, and lucky for me, there is a mod that'll let you enable and disable Fear 2's HUD, but it's not exactly a magic bullet type of solution. I mean, it definitely does get rid of your HUD, but it also gets rid of all on-screen elements. Pickup prompts, readable text, your meter letting you know how long you can cook your grenade throws, and even the damn options screen. I would say this is certainly a very cool mod to play around with, but most people playing the game for the first time should probably stay away from it until they know exactly how the game works and have experienced the entire story. It is a shame though, because the game is noticeably more immersive and easier to fall into while using it. On the plus side, a more easy on the eyes version of this HUD can be found in the game's DLC campaign Reborn, or at least it would be if the damn thing could actually hit the corners of the screen. I mean, yes, it is nice that HUD elements aren't sitting at an angle anymore, but are you telling me the devs couldn't have done this with it? Be honest, this is a massive improvement, right? It's like they heard all of the criticism of having such extraneous graphics inside the center of your screen, and they said, yes, you're correct about this, and we're going to make it so that if you wanted to, you could make it better, but we're not doing it ourselves. On the plus side though, the heads-up display actually goes away until you take damage or engage in combat, so I would say that's dangerously close to approaching a compromise, guys. Sadly, the dynamic light sources that made the original Fear such a GPU melter have seen a noticeable decrease in Fear 2. They are still here and they still look and work really well, but I just didn't find as many of them. And thanks to the less dark nature of the game, it just doesn't have the same effect that it did in the first one. Like I say almost every time I make one of these videos, it's not that hard-lined, well-defined sort of lighting that Fear had, but around this time developers were going for a more realistic, diffused sort of look to lighting, and even though it's not my favorite, it still looks great. One massive downgrade for me was the lack of debris thrown around during a gunfight. In the first Fear, bullets really tore up the environment around you, and in a heated fight with all kinds of destructible objects in the room, shit could get very John Woo-esque. Just look at me shooting a wall in both games. In Fear 1, the muzzle flash, sparks, dust, pieces of the wall, and bullet decals are all coming together to form a convincing effect, but doing the same thing in Fear 2 makes the sequel look like a low-budget follow-up. I mean, there are similar things going on, but just to a much lessened degree. It is crazy to me how much cheaper and less stylish this looks, and during gameplay, like you would expect, this makes for less cool-looking shootouts. I mean, let's put them back to back. You tell me which one looks better to you. And since we spent a little time talking about the few elements in Fear 2's gameplay that seem to actually improve on those found in the first game, I figured we should do the same for its presentation because, well, I've been pretty mean so far. Starting off with its textures, which are actually far improved compared to those found in Fear 1, which is always nice to see, and keeping in that lane since your enemies no longer make use of well-designed circular levels to force you into dynamic gunfights, both level geometry and texture work can be much more complex now. One of the areas that I really enjoyed looking at in the first Fear game were the office sections because it sort of felt like I'd seen something like that in real life before, and Fear 2 does a great job of making most of the locations you'll explore have that similar sort of feel, that kind of lived in, things have been moved around, someone actually existed here before the game took place kind of feeling. The starting hospital has this convincing, recently demolished aesthetic to it, and the nuked streets on the surface just look flat out amazing. I really wish I would have spent more time here. And here's something pretty surprising. I actually prefer most of the gun designs in Fear 2 compared to their Fear 1 counterparts. Well, except for the hammerhead. I gotta admit, this thing looks absolutely ridiculous to me, and Fear 1 nailed it way harder than this one does. Now, this next one isn't exactly something that Fear 2 holds over its predecessor necessarily, but I am really happy to say that the dynamic light sources here look great. And I only mention that here in this section because everything that transferred from the first game to the second was so horribly mangled that this one thing surviving unmolested is actually worth noting. Of course, I will admit that the overall brightness in this game is far increased over the first one, and I would say that makes for a less moody atmosphere, but you really have to give it up to Fear 2 because some of these areas just look flat out great. And really, that's about all I can think of. Now, some of you may argue that most of what I just listed could be explained by the time gap between the two games, and well, you'd be correct there. A lot changed in PC gaming hardware since Fear first hit the scene, and it makes sense that the bigger budget follow-up would outperform the plucky first entry. And in sheer technical terms, of course it does. But artistically speaking, I don't think there's many who would disagree that Fear 2 is the less attractive looking game despite all of the extra horsepower it has pumping under the hood. And having said all of that, I think I may be a little different from most people who review this game because I actually find Fear 2 to be a pretty good looking game in its own right. I know that may not have come across with me spending so much time bitching about it, but mostly that comes from the first game did it better kind of place. On its own, I think Fear 2 has some killer ideas. I don't really hate the concept of neon accent lights on enemies and a brighter color scheme overall. I just don't think it works very well in a game coming from such a well-established pedigree, visually speaking. Of course, I do have to be fair, there are some objective problems, like the colors and over-brightened, bloomed-out light sources making it hard to play the game sometimes, but these are issues that could be fixed with the smallest amount of tweaking. The design of the enemies, the game world, and the weapons you use are all great. I really like the style and uniqueness to the presentation. I just think that there's a lot that really limits it, and obviously a big portion of that is how far it's strayed from the game it's supposed to be sequeling. And once again, that puts me in a bit of a tough spot, because on one end, it's nice when a developer has the balls to do what it wants, even when that means going against an established style. But on the other, equally understandable side of that argument, why make a sequel to a video game if you're just going to change every aspect of it? I mean, at that point, maybe you should just start a new IP with all of these new ideas. I don't know, guys, it's a bit of a toss-up. I really could be convinced either way. Regardless, though, I think this game looks pretty alright. It probably should have been some kind of a cyberpunk shooter and not a sequel to Fear, but sometimes you just gotta play the hand you're dealt, and on the plus side, we got dealt an imperfect but pretty good looking hand here. And now we get to talk about the most interesting part of these videos as far as I'm concerned, the ports. Fear 1, if you'll remember, entered the market just a little before consoles of the day could run such technically impressive games and thus got a bit of a late start. But Fear 2 had versions available on both the 360 and the PS3 at the same time as its 2009 PC release. And you might figure with so much time passing between the two, that would equal a much better PS3 port than the original Fear got, but well, you can guess where this is going. Before it gets there though, I do have something horrible to admit. I cannot show you the Xbox 360 version of Fear 2 today. See, back when I lived in the US, I used to borrow my brother's 360 Elite to record footage for videos like this, but when I moved to Japan, that became a little harder than it used to be. You guys know that typically I get a kick out of showing you each and every port that a game gets and comparing them side by side so you can pick which one looks the best to you, but sadly that doesn't look like it's going to happen today. Finding an NA Region 360 here for what I would call a reasonable price, while not impossible, is proving to be a bit of a chore, so sadly I'm not going to be able to show you how the 360 and PS3 versions look side by side, but I can show you that same 360 version running on an Xbox Series X, which as it turns out is a really great way to play the game. But before we get to that, let's take a look at how Sony fared at the time. The PS3 port of Fear 2 is pretty standard for its day. The game offers 720p video output and a 30 FPS target, an interesting note being that it is 720p no matter what you do. For those of you that don't know, in some instances you can disable 720p as an option in the PS3's display menu, and the console will upscale an internal 720p to 1080. But since the PS3 doesn't have any built-in upscaling hardware that I'm aware of, this had to be done on a game-by-game basis, and it was the game's developers that had to code it. So it's not exactly common, and I wasn't surprised that it wasn't supported. What did surprise me though is when I unchecked 720p and started Fear 2 up, only to get the next step down, which is 480p, a resolution that's pretty damn odd to see blown up on a native 4K panel. And a cool little tidbit here is that reducing the output resolution does not increase performance like it intuitively does on PC, or at least it doesn't for 99% of the games out there. From what I can tell, a PS3 game is always going to render at its max resolution no matter what you have your console set to, so 480p is just a 720p picture being squashed down. I was actually pretty blown away to find out that some early release PS3 games were originally rendered out at that lower resolution, and in those cases, you do gain more performance from outputting 480p because resources are no longer being dedicated to software upscaling the picture. And you know, as I'm saying this, as I'm reading all these words off of my script, I'm thinking to myself, this right here is why no one watches my videos past the 25-minute mark. Moving on to stuff that people actually care about though, this port of Fear 2 looks pretty okay, or at least it does for such a low resolution game. The reflections are still impressive and the dynamic light sources look just as good and haven't seen their numbers cut from what I can tell. Obviously, the textures have been noticeably downgraded compared to PC, but that is to be expected, and let's be fair, at this low a resolution, you're probably not going to be able to tell the difference sitting a normal distance from your TV anyways. What you will see though is some really nasty looking aliasing thanks to there being no AA here, once again something that is expected, and continuing with the stuff you shouldn't be surprised by, Fear 2 on PS3 has a pretty abysmal frame rate. Not only is it really hard playing a first-person shooter at 30 frames per second, but more often than not, you will not be experiencing that full 30 FPS. I've seen it dip down as low as 11, and that comes with massive jumps up in frame time delivery, which makes things feel even more unresponsive. When the game was performing this bad, it was like there were literal seconds going by in between me hitting fire on my controller and my on-screen gun actually firing. And like you would reasonably imagine, fights that kick up a lot of environmental destruction, particles, and debris make for the perfect scenario for slowdown, so most fights I got into felt terribly difficult to play. I felt like I could barely track enemies, and it does not help that getting hit while aiming down sights makes your view bounce and move to a nauseating degree. To put things simply, I had a very hard time playing this game. Aiming, shooting, and moving felt really gross, and I just was not able to pull off anything that made the game feel satisfying. I also noticed that pre-rendered cutscenes weren't scaled to the full resolution of my screen, something that feels a little odd. I mean, these were originally in a 16:9 format, so I'm not exactly sure why they couldn't be stretched all the way to the corners of a 16:9 screen. Now, this isn't a knock against the game, but instead it's just something weird I wanted to mention, and in that same spirit, I was really surprised when I randomly looked down and could actually see the distance at which level of detail dropped. Of course, a lot of console games at the time, and really even now, will use a similar method to this so that the game isn't rendering full resolution images that the player can't even see, but I don't think I've ever seen a game where the distance is so close to your in-game character. I mean, look at this, it's inches away from his feet. And even more cool than that is there seems to be 3 levels of this effect. Look just past the first LOD drop, you can see just barely 2 larger circles, each one just a bit further from the last, where LOD is basically non-existent. By my estimation, these only affect the environment because 2D textures like these pieces of paper and the bad guy on the ground don't seem to lose any detail when they're beyond these circles. Some 3D aspects of the background, though, will disappear when beyond the third boundary. Little stuff like light switches, panels, or fire alarms. Nothing too important. And the cool little tidbits keep on rolling in, although I will admit, this one is sort of localized to the copy of the game that I'm playing. Like I said before, I live in Japan, and I have some good news and bad news as far as this video is concerned. The good news is Fear 2 was released here on PS3, but the bad news is it is damn hard to find secondhand. I tried Mandarake, Traders, Book Off, and a few smaller secondhand shops, but I just never came across it, so big thanks to my boy Jimmy Hoppa from Import Gaming for the win for snagging me a copy off of Mercari. But getting to the actual point here, with Japanese released video games comes the Japanese ratings board Sero, which is notorious for not allowing fun video game stuff like violent dismemberment. A buzzkill for sure, but it slips into the realm of pure comedy when you see enemies, instead of exploding into a shower of guts and gore, just disappearing into nothingness. This is something that can happen fairly often with close-up shots from the shotgun or explosive weapons, and it never fails to entertain me when I yeet a clone trooper out of existence in slow motion. Similarly, instead of censoring the last few moments of Alma's dad getting killed at the start of the game, Beckett and Aristide just watch a blank monitor and comment on a situation they couldn't possibly know about since neither of them can see or hear it going down. Now that is pretty funny, but it's also a little maddening because this is a pretty important plot point to know going into the game, and you won't have any idea Alma's been let out until later when it's said out loud.
My God, it's her.
The last real complaint I would have for this console version of Fear 2 would be the fact that it doesn't allow you to turn off the nasty looking low-res noise filter or the motion blur, both of which at 720p 30 look absolutely terrible. So far, you might get the feeling that it's been mostly complaints, and that's pretty much true. All in all, this game does not play very well on the PS3, but to be fair, this is a pretty typical PC port for its day. I honestly feel for people who only had one of these consoles and had to get their first-person shooting done primarily like this. This may go without saying, but I'll go ahead and say it anyways. Nowadays, there's no real reason to play Fear 2 on PS3. It's not necessarily terrible in context of other PC ports at the time, but in a vacuum, it's pretty bad. I will say that most of its issues are the fault of the hardware it was released on and not necessarily bad porting decisions, but they are issues nonetheless. So if I were you, I wouldn't exactly go out and try to find yourself a copy of Fear 2 on PS3. And if you do, definitely don't get the Japanese version, trust me.
Bye now. See you in hell.
Moving on, we have the backwards compatible version of Fear 2 running on an Xbox Series X. This port operates at 1080p with a frame rate target of 60. Based on my research, a lot of people seem to think that only Fears 1 and 3 received a speed boost on the higher-end hardware, but I can personally confirm 2 is included on that list as well. Now, I will admit it is a little disappointing that the game doesn't output at 4K or even 1440p, but there's only so much you can expect from a free upgrade. Besides, coming from the PS3's 720p image, this is amazingly clean and clear, so you're not going to hear any complaints from me in this sentence. But it is always nice to play a fast-paced shooter at the frame rate the good Lord intended, so that's cool. Speaking of which, there's something odd going on here. After I put down my controller with the Series X port of Fear 2, I came away feeling like it had an impressively stable frame rate. When I fed some of my clips into some software to confirm that, though, I found all kinds of dips. I mean, it definitely wasn't as frequent a problem as the PS3 version, but when I was playing that port, I felt those dips. Here in the Series X version, I was under the impression that things stayed at 60 nearly the whole time. So that's kind of weird, and I'm not really sure how to explain it. Maybe better frame delivery? I don't know. On the negative end, just like the PS3 port, you can't disable stuff like the status effect and motion blur, although I will admit at 60 FPS, that blur is much easier on the eyes. And since we're talking about frame rates, man is this version so much more fun to play. I was able to not only survive the game's encounters on Series X, but also pull off some cool shit. On PS3, every fight that I managed to live through only left me with the feeling I had somehow lucked into not dying. At 60 frames per second though, I could actually track targets, hit the stuff I was shooting at, and respond to enemy grenade throws. It was such a noticeable difference, and it truly felt like playing a different game. A much more fun and entertaining one. Both ports offer a pretty healthy auto-aim, but on PS3 I could never really make use of it because I had such a hard time moving, aiming, and shooting at the same time. On Series X, it was actually a tool I could take advantage of, which is good because as a lot of you guys know, I really struggle at playing shooters with analog sticks. Oh, and remember the whole 3 circles of LOD distance thing on PS3? Well, I'm not sure if it's because the 360 version just operates differently or if it's the jump up to 1080p, but it's a very different story here. First off, I could barely tell the same thing was even happening. I had to get up off of my couch and get face to face with the TV before I could see where the LOD dropped, and even now looking at the footage, if I didn't tell you guys where it was, you might not even see it. And on top of that, I cannot for the life of me see the other 2 sections where this is taking place. I want to say it's definitely the resolution to blame here, but I don't know. I kind of feel like the sharper pixels would have the opposite effect and make it more obvious. Man, I really wish I had that original 360 version to test against. Regardless though, this is by far the best way to play Fear 2 on console. It's smooth and satisfying, but there is some weird stuff going on as well. Fairly often during my playthrough, I noticed that the reticle on my red dot sight would disappear. This seemed to happen on both the assault rifle and SMG, and I'm not really sure what the hell's going on there. Also, when the game shows the loading screen, main menu, or the auto-saving prompt, both my TV and capture card lose sync, and I'm not really sure why. Because this is an upscale, my only guess would be that these screens are displayed at a different resolution and the console has to switch, but that doesn't exactly explain it happening when the game autosaves during actual gameplay. I am used to seeing stuff like this, but usually it's when a 240p game is running through one of my scalers and it switches to a 480i screen. Now, this is not something that's going to drive you crazy, and you probably won't see it all too often, but it was definitely weird enough for me to mention. And before I close this section out, I want to mention this, because after covering quite a few of these Series X backwards compatible titles, I don't think I've really talked about it, but these are essentially free upgrades. If you happen to have your physical copy of Fear 2 still, or any other game on the supported list, you can just pop it into your Series X and get a better looking and running version of that game. That's pretty damn cool. I mean, if these games were just running in their base form on some emulation layer, that wouldn't be anything important enough to mention, but these games are not only being upscaled, but they're also getting their frame rates improved. That involves a lot more work than you might think. Essentially, each one of these backwards compatible titles had to be hand adjusted to achieve these upgrades, and if you ask me, even though the list of supported games is not as long as I would like, I mean, it's a free service. I would say that alone makes the Series X a damn good value, depending on what OG Xbox and 360 games you already own, especially if you're looking to play a little Fear 2. And before we close this one out, here's what each version looks like side by side. I would give my commentary here, but the takeaway should be pretty obvious. PC is the strongest showing in every way, but if you do have to play this game on console, there's only one real option, and it most definitely is not the PS3. Series X takes second prize no problem, and PS3 is only on the list because I've developed an increasingly worrying obsession with seeing old, irrelevant legacy ports next to their modern brothers. In closing, I gotta say, Fear 2 is a weird little title. It is about as far from the first Fear game as a first-person shooter can get. It follows almost none of the design principles that made Fear such an awesomely fun, atmospheric shooter. Instead of allowing for tightly controlled arenas with multiple entries and exits, Part 2 sticks with linear, closed-off areas. Enemy tactics are nowhere near as complex and challenging, shooting is far less satisfying, and none of the guns supply the kind of impact even the weakest gun in Part 1 featured. Instead of black leather and modern Spec Ops, Fear 2 gives us cyberpunk and neon. There's almost too many differences to count, so if you're grading the game based on how well it followed up the original Fear, it fails in nearly every conceivable way. It flat out does not offer the same experience, or even one that sort of gets close. In those terms, it is a failure, and because of that I can understand the absolute thrashing it got by fans when it was released. But to be totally honest with you, playing it right now with very little emotional investment in the series, I gotta say, it's not a horrible game. It can be very fun and offers an enjoyable experience. Of course, it does suffer from some really stupid problems. The kind of problems you wouldn't think would plague a game coming from developers who had already figured out how to make a great shooter, but despite that, I think Fear 2 stands as a pretty good game on its own. The fact that it's a follow-up to such a beloved title like Fear sort of ensures that 90% of people who play it won't be able to judge it in a vacuum, but I think if you can, you'll likely find it a pretty serviceable playthrough. In my opinion, the story is interesting, the style is kind of unique, and the shooting, while flawed, has a tendency to be pretty damn cool, but in the end, how you feel about this game is likely going to come down to your expectations. If you're thinking you're about to jump into yet another pulse-pounding, techno-goth, slow-motion shooter, you will be sorely disappointed. But if you're expecting to boot up a pretty okay shooter, well, that's exactly what you're going to find. And with that, I think it's about time I get out of here. Thank you all so very much for coming and hanging out for a bit. I'd love to see all of you back again for the next one, but until then, as usual, I'm Jared.
Have you ever seen a hippopotamus fight? They start crapping and wagging their tails really fast and shit just flies everywhere.
And this is Avalanche Reviews. If you just so happen to be looking to grab yourself Fear 2, let me save you some time and effort. You don't have to type it into Google. You can just check the link in the description and get it from goodoldgames.com. Not only do you get a nice price, but I also get a bit of a kickback. Of course, there's the obligatory mention of my Patreon and YouTube members program, and then there's videos on screen if you want to click them. Oh, and please don't be fooled by some dork with my picture as their avatar telling you to message them on Telegram. I can barely keep up with YouTube and Twitter. I am not about to start talking to people on a third platform. Well, alright guys, have yourselves a good one, and I will talk to you all next time. Mwah. Bye.